Jeffrey Price is an art historian. For nearly 50 years, he has been collecting, curating, and selling Escher's original graphics. A deep interest in Escher's work drives Jeffrey's scholarship. In his own words, Escher images illustrate our search for order in a seemingly chaotic world. His prints reveal the vast gaps between the immutable laws that govern all creation and the pictures we make of what we see around us. Today, Jeffrey will present an illustrated talk, followed by a group discussion on stage that, as I mentioned, you will be invited to join. Jeffrey, thank you for bringing your work and ideas to us and enriching the dialogue between scientific research and the artistic manifestations of the perceiving human brain and mind.
Thank you, Seth. I'm going to show you what M.C. Escher called his amazing images. He liked that phrase, and he wanted it to be the title of the first book on his work, Amazing Images. But the publisher turned it down. He'd worked out a kind of complicated crossword here, using the phrase in Dutch and in English. And it was unfortunate that the publisher rejected his title, but I thought it was too good to waste. So when I published my book of pictures and essays about Escher last year, I titled it Amazing Images. But what does it mean to be amazed? It's very different from looking at something. When you're truly amazed, nothing else matters, and you are focused just on the project in front of you. And this can happen when you're engrossed in a video game, if you are skiing, or performing open heart surgery. And it can happen to a mathematician when he's perfecting an equation. From an early age, Escher could lose himself in shapes and patterns. And here's a statue of Escher showing us something he found fascinating as a child. He'd take the cheese sandwich that his mother had made him for lunch, carefully break the pieces of the cheese into creative shapes so that he could rearrange them back on the bread so that they neatly aligned with the crust. I first saw Escher's art when my father brought home books that were popular in the history of science department at Yale, where he taught in the mid-60s. I love the books, especially this museum catalog that shows some of Escher's preliminary drawings. I remember looking through that book with a magnifying glass so often that the pages fell out. And I wanted to see what Escher had hidden in the pictures and what his secrets were. That passion never left me. I studied Escher's work in high school and college, and as soon as I could, I designed a shop where I could exhibit Escher's prints, and for decades I showcased Escher's original graphics in my art gallery, Artists Market in Connecticut. Hundreds of Escher prints traveled from my walls into collections and museums around the world. Here you see prints and photographs from Escher's studio, which I exhibited in the 1980s, and that was just a perfect time because the works from Escher's personal collection and studio had just become available, and I was one of the few people to see them. I closed my gallery a few years ago, and that gives me more time to travel the world in search of Escher prints. And even Escher's earliest works show his love for patterns. Young Escher wasn't a good student. He showed no ability whatsoever for mathematics. And with failing grades and incomplete tests, he was only able to continue in school through the intervention of his father, who was a respected engineer and a government official. Fortunately, he found a printmaking teacher who took him under his wing and inspired him by showing him how to make a woodcut. As soon as he discovered this technique, he knew exactly what he wanted to do, what his career would be. He wanted to become a graphic artist and create woodblock prints. Now, to make a print from a piece of wood, you don't need many tools, but learning to use them well can take a lifetime. You need a block of wood, some chisels, and ink, what you see here on your screen. Now, when you start carving that block, everything that's going to be white in your print has to be cut away from the block with a knife or a chisel. Then you rub the ink on the piece of wood and press it against paper, much like you would a rubber stamp. Right from the start, Escher made pictures of things with patterns. Here's an early woodcut he made of a hand holding a pine cone, and look closely at the enlargement on the right. Every scale is actually a very carefully shaped little black lozenge, and these shapes spiral up the cone. The arrangement of the scales on a pine cone, mathematicians understand to follow a Fibonacci sequence. But for Escher, it was all about the patterns, and he made no sense at all of the numbers or the formulas. The hand looks round and strong, and that is an effect you get by cutting away strips of wood to leave little black lines that taper and curve at the end. And I brought one of Escher's woodblocks with me today. You can see it later in the program. The more you look, the more amazing Escher's pictures become. Indeed, there is simply more to see in an Escher print than in other art. I'll prove it to you. Escher carved this unusual design on his woodblock. He inked the surface and printed 8 heads that fit together. Some of them are upside down, some the right way up, but this was just the beginning. Here's Escher's final print. He's taken his woodblock and printed parts of it 8 times around the center block. In case you lost track, this might make it a little easier for you. And now the 8 heads have multiplied. And in fact, Escher could add as many heads as he wanted to his design. This could go on forever. In fact, Escher's woodblock is like a seed that can grow an infinite number of images. Now, the purpose of a woodblock is to make an image that can be printed again and again. That's how it's different from painting. You make a block, and you can make many prints from it. And Escher equated being a printmaker to being like a troubadour who would sing his song and take his message from town to town. And each print Escher made told the same story as when he printed his block for the first time. And when Escher was finished carving, he'd make a few prints and store them in his studio. Occasionally he exhibited them and sold them in a small gallery. But for the first 50 years of Escher's life, there was very little demand for his prints. They were simply different from other art. So he didn't print very many, and these were sold for small sums in Holland. Fortunately, Escher was supported by his parents, and then he married well. And those are the secrets to an artist's survival. Shortly after making this print, Escher traveled to Italy, where he fell in love with the rolling hills and the ancient towns, and Escher loved exploring the towns and the rugged landscapes that were so different from the flat polders of Holland. Here he shows us the area around Castrovalva. Imagine you're standing on the path in the lower left. Walking forward, the town is far overhead, and to get there, you'll have to take a long walk around the mountain. But if you're there by the flowers and you take a step to the right, be careful. You'll find yourself tumbling down a bottomless cliff into a distant landscape. And if you survive a fall, you can then walk for miles on pathways through villages and fields. You'll eventually come to the mountains near the horizon, but there's another village. It seems like it's made out of sugar cubes. And beyond that's a long road leading to a valley. And finally, there's one last mountain there just under the crisp edge of the dark clouds. And look up at those clouds, move your eye around, and you will be back at Castrovalva. The details, the perspective, and all that distance fill your senses and imagination. Escher loved Italy, and so he rented a house in Rome, where he lived and worked for more than a dozen years. Look at Escher's woodcut of the coast of Amalfi on your left. If you were standing where Escher was, when he made the picture in the lower left, at your feet is a dark stairway. Look at the steps, and then you see they're all made from tiny chips in the wood. There's a detail of that on the right. Go back to the print and climb down the steps, and you could walk along the long beach, past all those fishing boats and buildings, and eventually you come to a dark tower at Land's End. And looking at the enlargement of that in the upper right, you'll see that it's all covered in polka dots. And past the tower, beyond the sea, there's a mountain range made from thousands of scratches of Escher's knife. When we step back, we see the world, but look closely and you'll see very different things. Atoms, molecules, and crystals invisibly fill our world like Escher's scratches. What we see, we believe to be reality itself. But it's all in our mind. Our eyes see Escher's black ink on white paper, and our imagination creates a seacoast. Escher's genius was making images with hidden complexities, and that gives us a sense of wonder and amazement precisely because they were so hard to visualize. And they took extraordinarily concentrated craftsmanship to carve and print. When you see an Escher print, usually the first reaction is to want to see some more, to discover how Escher imagined all that you're seeing and made it visible by stamping ink on paper. Imagine if we saw the world in black and white with no shades of gray. I find that quite impossible. But Escher taught himself to see in special ways. Once Escher's son asked him why he had spent all day drawing an insect he'd found on the steps in the morning. In order to see it, I had to draw it, said Escher. Escher remembered what he'd seen by making drawings of things, taking photographs, collecting postcards. Those were the fun and easy tasks compared to making a print. You can do only one thing when you make a woodcut. You can cut away wood so that you create spaces that will show the paper and not the ink. Carving a woodblock gives you only lines and edges, and the artist arranges these to help us believe that we're seeing a dragonfly. And here you see a close-up of the leaf and the wing. On the left, Escher has limited himself to only carving straight, horizontal, and vertical lines. They can be thick or thin. Their spacing varies. And then we believe we're seeing the leaf's soft contours. To limit your technique to only straight lines is like trying to write a poem only using the letters in the first half of the alphabet. To replicate the dragonfly's iridescent wings, Escher has cut hundreds of little shapes, some squares that grow larger and larger, and some are blocks that look like houses, while others contain combs or forks of sharp black lines. Escher visited the Alhambra Palace in Granada and saw tiles like these, designed by Moorish craftsmen hundreds of years before. And he was mesmerized and drew painstaking copies of what he saw. Shapes like this, tessellations of repeating shapes, would intrigue Escher for the rest of his life. Islamic tiles were pure geometry. Their religion forbade the representation of creatures. Escher, however, discovered that by jiggling the edges of the shapes, all sorts of marvelous things could be created. These happy, tumbling boys fit together and could fill a wall and go on forever. You can see triangles and diamonds, little pencil lines that were Escher's guidelines. And I brought with me a very simple worksheet where you can make your own tessellations. If you can draw a tic-tac-toe board, you too can make interlocking shapes. Living in Rome became difficult in the mid-30s when the government ordered Escher's 2 young sons to become part of Mussolini's brown shirts, the fascist youth brigade. Escher decided to move his family back north where he could be safer and be near his parents in the Netherlands. And when Escher was no longer surrounded by the lush landscapes of Italy, his work changed and became more cerebral. Some say he turned landscapes to mindscapes, but there's more to it than that. Here we see one of Escher's most famous prints, Day and Night, created in 1938. On the left, we see a Dutch village where people walk beside canals and watch ships sail upriver. In the center, Escher creates a sort of magic trick where the rectangular fields at the bottom of the picture start to wiggle and their borders shift, and then, like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, dark birds appear and fly over the village into a daytime sky. But look to the right, and white birds fly over that same village, now in darkness. The streets are deserted, lights shine through the windows, and the ships return with their lights twinkling in the darkness. White birds and black birds fit together, and daytime and nighttime occupy the same space. German forces occupied the Netherlands in May of 1940, and things changed slowly at first, with the new commanders assuring the public that their rules were for the best, and the changes they made were necessary to make the country great again. Some patterns do repeat themselves, don't they? The Dutch are an independently minded people, and they were proud of the success of their country. They didn't want anything to do with the new Germans in town. And so while Holland was decimated by the war, many resisted the changes. Escher made the small protest woodcut you see here in the background. The words have double meanings and disguise the message, which likened the occupation of their country to being in a toilet that was occupied. But one day the filth would be flushed away and they would be free. Escher dated the print December 5th, 1941. And a print like this could only be circulated secretly among friends. The situation in the Netherlands continued to deteriorate, and soon anyone making an image like this, or even having a copy of it in your pocket, could be shot. Then Escher was sent the German directive you see in the center. Artists were now permitted only to show and sell art that was approved by the German Aesthetic Commission. Escher wrote a note at the bottom, you see here, and he said, "Terribly sorry, I can't sign your form, and I won't make art that way." That meant he had to create in isolation, without an audience and without an income. Cut off from society, Escher created this picture, where angels and devils fit together seamlessly. In the bottom margin, he has written Christmas, 1941. Life became increasingly difficult in the Netherlands after that. Creating artwork in seclusion, Escher intensified his creativity, and he used it to insulate himself from the terror and the daily struggles and fear in the world around him. In 1942, Escher began carving this sphere with the angels and devils that he had drawn at Christmas. He would hide the ball when he was not working on it, in case an inspector knocked on the door. And when Escher was working, he could forget for a while what was going on around him. He could carve his ball and not think of the hunger his children faced, knowing finding food the next day would be uncertain. Thinking very hard about how to design the sphere, he could stop thinking about his beloved printmaking teacher who had been dragged from his home and murdered in Auschwitz. And Escher made no drawings of this project. Their discovery would put his family at risk. He imagined something so complicated that the world ceased to exist while he was bringing his vision to life. He worked tirelessly, spending many months carving this globe. The angels and devils fit together equally around the equator of the sphere. But now imagine you're holding this globe in your hand and you turn it slowly towards the North Pole. And here the angels have grown in high relief over a flattened background that's been carved clear of devils. Now, turn the ball again, past the equator where those angels and devils share the sphere, to the other side. And now the devils rise like dark cliffs above some distant earth. Where are the angels now? Darkness and light, angels and devils. Will we see goodness or evil on our globe? During the 5 long years of war, there was no way of knowing which forces would triumph. In Europe, during wartime, there was little room for neutrality. One had to be clear about which side you were on. And in his work, Escher had to be certain about what he would carve away and what should be preserved. Cut off from his audience and the world, Escher created his own realities. In 1943, Escher completed his print Reptiles. And here we see Escher's desktop. His notebook is open, showing a design of hexagons inhabited by reptiles. This was one of about 130 drawings he made after visiting Alhambra, and he devised his own system for creating interlocking creatures. Mathematicians had studied it before. He wasn't interested in their work. He wanted to do it himself. And seeing the tiles of the Alhambra inspired Escher. Here, little reptiles crawl off the flat page and walk over a triangle to get to the top of a dodecahedron. And here, the creature lets out a great snort. Now his work is done, and he can return to the page. Showing what can happen when 2 dimensions become 3 is especially intriguing when the drama is played out on a flat piece of paper that has no 3rd dimension at all. And here we see light projected from a digital file onto a screen, and still we believe we're seeing some real reptiles crawling out of a drawing. Escher didn't assign meanings to his prints, he called them his little games. Each viewer creates their own meaning, some of which are universal and some are personal. Escher's prints make us take a second look at what we see at first glance. Well, the war finally ended, and Escher made this little wood engraving with the motto in Dutch, "We komen eruit," we shall come out of it. Wartime had been disastrous, and rebuilding after the war seemed impossible. As the Germans were forced out, they destroyed the utilities. There was no heat, there was no water, there was no light. They ruined the transportation, tore up the railroad tracks, took the food supplies with them, and left the Dutch with no infrastructure or means to rebuild the country. The phrase Escher carved was meant to give hope to those people. And in this print, Escher shows us that even if things are dark and we feel trapped, if we stretch out our hands one more time, we can grab the top rung of the ladder, and we can climb out of the dark well, and then we'll reach home. We'll see trees bloom, and birds will fly in the free sky above. Well, after the war, Escher was able to exhibit his art again, although the world of Dutch printmakers was very small. Here we see a poster showing prints from a group of 4 artists. 3 of them we don't know much about, and their artworks, well, they might be unremarkable. But you can pick out Escher's print of 4 fish at the upper left, and the fish fit together perfectly. They leave a gap in the middle, and that defines the shape of a single bird, which is easy to miss at first glance. There's always more to look at in an Escher print. Once Escher was able to exhibit his art again, mathematicians became aware of his prints, and he was invited to speak at an international crystallography conference in Cambridge, England in 1960. One of the mathematicians there, Donald Coxeter, sent Escher this drawing, together with a journal article he'd written regarding the formulas for hyperbolic geometry on which this pattern is based. Well, Escher could make no sense whatsoever of all those numbers and symbols, but he was excited to draw out a plan based on Escher's pattern to make his own designs. To do this, he drew lines and circles in much the same way as ancient tile makers must have done. Escher knew that to make mosaic patterns like this, you need only to be able to make straight lines and circles. So Escher set to work to fill in the spaces, and about 20 years after carving his angels and devils sphere during the wartime, Coxeter's hyperbolic geometry patterns enabled Escher to create a circular print filled with an endless pattern of angels and devils. Hyperbolic geometry produces patterns that look like they might have been painted on a basketball. Escher found a clever way to make certain that the figures all would be identical. And in so doing, he also created the most efficient way of making this image with a woodblock. Instead of carving the entire circle, Escher created a wedge that made 1/3 of the design. He printed that block 3 times around so that all the edges fit together. The 3 blocks allow the bats to fit together like a perfect jigsaw puzzle. And when he did that, now you can see the angels surrounding the devils, just as the devils surround the angels. To print the gray in the angels, by the way, Escher had to carve a second pie-shaped woodblock with exactly the pattern to fill them in, and he had to print that 3 times around. So 6 printings from 2 blocks. It's efficient, it's complicated, and it was necessary. How many angels and devils inhabit the edges of this print? And remember, every white space is cut away with a chisel. It's amazing. I have a proof print from each of Escher's 2 blocks right over here. Escher's technique not only made his prints possible, but the intensity of his craft amplifies their message. Let's see how Escher created a print. You might recognize some of these designs. At the top left, you see a polished piece of cherry wood with a hole in it. If you noticed a second hole, that was drilled at the State Museum in Holland under Escher's direction so that nobody would reprint his woodblocks after he died. At the top right, you see the result of Escher spreading greenish ink on the flat block, making it a little lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. In the upper right, you see a print from that block. The ivory paper shows through the hole. And then Escher carved a mud puddle into the block at the lower left. You can see a lot of chisel marks where Escher carved out the hollow. The pattern of chisel marks actually looks like the bottom of a puddle, but only the top of the block receives Escher's brown ink. And at the bottom right, you see the result of printing this block on top of the greenish sheet with the hole in it. Now the hole magically becomes a moon. And water fills the puddle and reflects the sky above. Shapes have become things. And the things trigger scripts in our imagination. But Escher still has a lot to add to this image. This is part of Escher's 3rd woodblock. What appears here as smooth silver and brown is the surface of the block that Escher will ink. He's carved away a lot of the surface, and what remains appears as tire tracks, footprints, and a lot of odd shapes. Roll some black, oily ink onto the surface of the block, just the right amount. Too much ink will fill in the tiny gaps between the lines, and then align this block precisely on top of the sheet with the hole in the puddle, apply exactly the right amount of pressure, lift the block away, And finally, you can see Escher's woodcut puddle, again, which he completed in 1952. Much of what you see is an illusion. Trees are only present in their reflection. The actual trees were drawn by Escher in Italy 25 years earlier. He kept his nose. And when we see them in the print, we believe trees grow somewhere outside the puddle. Branches are silhouetted in the front, and in the front of the distant moon's reflection. We're seeing reflections, and we can see the past as well. We know people have walked here, and they left footprints. We see a car and a bicycle must have come by. They left their own prints in the soft earth, prints within a print. Creating this woodcut meant Escher had to ink his 3 blocks and print them by hand each time he wanted to make a copy. When it was perfect, he signed the print on the left and added the note Eigendruck on the right, which means I myself printed this. And it certainly was an achievement to be proud of. Word spread, and Scientific American put Escher on the cover in 1961, and Escher's Horseman appeared on the cover of a book about atomic physics. Here at MIT, Escher was invited by the molecular biology department to speak in 1960, and in 1964 he spoke right here at the MIT Museum. And you can see the museum's rather stark exhibit of Escher's prints on your screen. And if anyone can locate an audio recording of Escher speaking here, contact me, since you will have discovered the only record of Escher speaking English, which apparently he did quite well. But academics weren't the only ones discovering Escher's work. His work was featured in Life magazine and Time magazine and in publications around the world. His images became part of popular culture. Musicians became early collectors of Escher's prints. Graham Nash and Jimmy Page bought his graphics in California. Mata Hoople colorized reptiles for their record album. I'm sure you all remember all the young dudes. Well, here they are. Mick Jagger wanted to use an Escher print for a Rolling Stones album, but Escher turned him down. He was too busy with other projects. You can see my own psychedelic Escher t-shirt in the upper right, above a shot of the Simpsons encounter with an Escher room. Escher designs decorated kids' puzzles, neckties, and clothing. Escher-esque became an adjective. When Escher was 70 years old, he was given his first large museum show, and his fame continued to grow. Several galleries in America started selling Escher prints for increasingly high prices. Requests for Escher's graphics piled up in his small studio in his home in Barn, Holland. I don't want to be a printing machine, Escher told one of his customers. I want to create only as many graphics as I wish to print, and I need time to create new work. He dreamed of making one last print. As you might expect, he made it complicated. And I see it as his crowning achievement. His health deteriorated, and as he recovered from one operation after another, I believe he was more afraid of dying than he was more afraid of not finishing this last print than he was of dying. To make this great print, Escher carved the 3 woodblocks you see on your left. On the right, you see a print of the top block, showing rings and snakes, and the block in the middle at the left with green ink fills in the snakes, and the bottom block accents the rings. 3 blocks printed one on top of another created the wedge you see on the left, and print each of the blocks 2 more times to create 2 more segments, and that enables 3 wedges to fit together in a perfect puzzle. Here, the seemingly infinite tiny rings in the center grow larger, and they get larger and larger as they link together, as if the linking itself energizes their growth. They grow bigger and bigger, and when they get as big as they can be, well, then snakes appear. Snakes have symbolized power and the troubles human consciousness faces since the Garden of Eden. Here they writhe in and out of the rings, their life force weaving into the elemental chains. And having reached their apex, the rings now become smaller and smaller again, heading towards infinity at the edge of the print. Ring snakes required 9 printings from those 3 woodblocks, and Escher only had enough time left to print a few examples of his masterpiece. Here you see Escher hanging up some copies of this print to dry in his studio. He'd done all he could. He'd completed his masterpiece. But he said he could fill another lifetime making prints. Escher kept raising his prices to slow down demand, but he created so few prints that the prices quickly escalated. Escher died in 1972, and his fame continued to grow. Escher had seldom charged more than a few $100s for a print. A couple of years ago, an example of his print Reptiles sold at Sotheby's for $780,000. Fortunately for collectors, Escher created a number of small woodcuts which are affordable to collectors even today, and I specialize in these smaller prints, and I enjoy their intimacy. A few years ago, a museum in Brazil achieved the greatest attendance record for any museum in the world when it exhibited Escher's prints. This is an exhibit of Escher's work that was in Houston a couple of years ago. Every museum show allows new generations to discover Escher's prints. Here in Boston, not only does the MIT Museum have a nice collection of Escher's original prints, but the Boston Public Library has digitalized their own collection, and the prints are in high definition, so you can download them as long as you abide by copyright regulations. We have yet to see what happens when AI joins with Escher in the metaverse. There's so much more to be learned from Escher prints as we explore our own perceptions and how images help us make sense of a truly baffling world when we use our imagination and our intelligence. Escher wrote, "I try in my prints to testify that we live in a beautiful and orderly world and not in a formless chaos as it sometimes seems." Escher's changed my life in extraordinary ways, and I continue to learn from his prints every day. If you have an Escher print on your wall, you have a book on your bookshelf, I guarantee you'll learn from it. I hope after this quick tour that you'll look at his prints closely and the world around you with an increased sense of wonder. Look carefully and be amazed. That brings me to the end of my talk, but not the end of the program. We have more to discuss. I hope you'll stick around. Thank you all very much, and special thanks to everybody up on the screen here. Wow. That's a good half hour of Escher.
Let's do that. And then this is the one that you can move the ball with.
Passcode over here.
And get that in there.
Jeffrey, your passcode for the iPad.
Jeffrey, thank you. That was
really was a journey, and I appreciate how much information you seamlessly fit into that presentation. It only lets me know how much more information you hold. And perhaps now we can tap a bit of that in discussion. I can start off with a question. It's really just a very open question, but I will give you first opportunity. One fragment of a quote from your talk. Now the whole becomes the moon. And you alluded to, or to paraphrase, you said, well, a couple things. There's always more to see in an Escher print. And you suggested that Escher's art is somehow more potent in that regard than perhaps other artworks. And I wonder, what is the significance? Now the whole becomes the moon. How powerful is that?
That's a great question, Seth. I think it has to do with looking at things very closely. And when we do that, we're drawing from a visual vocabulary in our brains that we make up every time we look at something. Whether you're a baby figuring out that that thing out there is your mother, or us looking and recognizing each other, it takes a huge amount of brain work to know what we're looking at, to recognize people. What a mystery that is. But we take all those clues, and I think we like to tell ourselves stories. We want to feel comfortable. We want to be in a place we recognize. So all this color and shape that we take in, we look in our dictionary of images and say, I'm safe. I'm sitting in a chair, that's a tree, that must be the moon. Although it could be the sun. So sometimes you gotta watch out for those ambiguities.
Okay, let me follow up on that a little bit. I was thinking about the astonishing cross-cultural global appeal of Escher that you touched on a little bit, but whether it's like Jimmy Page or the show in Brazil, it seems like Escher's work is tapping into something very fundamental about how we see, maybe even some kinds of perceptual universals. And I know, well, I conceive of you as the world expert in many ways on the notion of like perceptual universals, what we share and what the little corners are that we might not share. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you think about perceiving Escher's prints, especially as a vision scientist, or what aspects of perception they tap into that could in any way explain why people around the world, young people and elderly people, all seem to be so captivated and amused by these images.
Thank you, Karthik. And I should say, Karthik is way too generous. In his assessment of me, I'm by no means the world expert in perception. But firstly, thank you, Jeffrey, for this really incredible journey through a landscape in the mind and work of an artist that I've admired for a very long time. I first came across Escher's works when I was a high school student in India, and I didn't know who was the artist who was making these pictures, but I just immediately fell in love with those pictures. And Karthik, to your question, what is it that draws me, talking about cross-cultural appeal, a young student sitting in India, why am I drawn to these pictures? I think it's this notion of discovering something that might not be apparent at the very first glance, but the more you look at these pictures, the more richness you derive from them. And I think the brain is wired to take pleasure from these discoveries. And there's a whole other rant that I can go into as to how, with the advent of recommendation systems and AI things that are supposed to make our lives easy by cutting down on that discovery process. Instead of making things easy for us, they're probably denying us of a very elemental aspect of what makes the world pleasurable to us. But that's a separate issue. But because Escher invites us to discover so many nuances in his pictures, I think that's why all of us, we can't help but be drawn to this. I wanted to pick up on the quote that you shared with us at the end, where Escher says that I try in my work to convince you that the world is orderly and beautiful instead of just a chaos. And that, I had not seen that quote before, but it immediately reminded me of a quote from another great luminary, William James, who was considered the father of American psychology. In fact, the Department of Psychology at Harvard is housed in a building that bears William James's name. So William James, in describing the perceptual world of a newborn, talked about the blooming, buzzing confusion that a newborn experiences. And to the extent that Escher is pointing out that the world is actually beautiful and orderly and not chaotic, there is a progression, a link to be made between the world of a neonate and the world that we apparently inhabit, an orderly world. And my lab, as Seth pointed out, focuses on understanding what is this process, the developmental process by which we transform a chaotic sensorium into an organized sensorium. And I think it's a fascinating, fascinating process that we have barely the beginnings of an understanding of. One of the dimensions along which this development happens is the dimension of locality versus non-locality of processing. And I think that's a theme that comes up repeatedly in Escher's work. So say when you look at night and day, or reptiles, or metamorphosis, if you look at a local section of the image, yes, you can interpret it as, say, a frog or a crocodile. But then the beauty of the work lies in extending your zone of analysis from those local patterns and trying to see how the global structure fits together. And I think that ability has a very interesting developmental progression. And I would love to study more of that. In fact, the population that Seth mentioned that we are working with, so children who were born blind, but with treatable conditions, and then as adolescents or teenagers, we are able to bring them sight, so they begin to see for the very first time, say at the age of 10 or 15. We would like to understand what is the timeline of them being able to stitch together the local pieces of information they're getting into a coherent global whole, or being able to say that the whole does not make sense. And I think Escher's work can inspire the kinds of stimuli we use. So let me pause there.
Well, that was great, Pavan. Thank you. In fact, it inspired a thought that I'd like to share. It resonates with what you just said. It occurs to me that one way, at least for myself, to get at what is so captivating about these images is that they show the chaos, the ambiguity, the blooming, buzzing confusion in known terms. So in a sense, you could imagine we don't have access to early visual processing of, for example, the neonate or the infant. And by the time we get to developed vision or a developed visual brain, we're dealing with objects and spaces and motion in the world. We don't understand where that order comes from because we know early visual processing is blooming, buzzing confusion. Escher's work shows us, I think, features of early visual processing in clear, known terms: ambiguity, local, spatial, and temporal, local visual processing. That's exactly what's going on here. And we need to grab the whole, and maybe even in some cases we can't. But that is resonant, I think, with early visual processing.
Can I add one thing to that? I think Karthik mentioned that Escher seems to resonate all over the world, and indeed shows in Japan and Australia and everywhere seem to attract audiences. And I'm fascinated by that idea. I think it might be related to something Carl Jung called archetypal imagery. For instance, if you look at art around the world, you'll see certain things. You'll see a symbol for water. You'll see snakes. You'll see little zigzag lines and ladders. And these can be in an Aboriginal rock painting, or in a Asian scroll, or in something from Aztec culture. So Escher gets down to the essence of black, white, good, evil, what's real, what's not real. And because those are universal themes, I think Escher attracts audiences, whether they're young or old. I've taught and talked about Escher to kindergarten kids and college professors. And that's unusual for art, but I think it does get at that idea we all share certain images and certain symbols that give us meaning.
And we all share a human brain. And so to what extent does this work reflect structures and functions of the human brain? I mean, I believe that all art does. All art encodes vision. Sometimes it's pronounced, sometimes it's not. But I think one way to describe this dialogue between visual arts and vision's neuroscience that I touched upon in the introduction is that the deep, methodical, first-hand practice of vision has a lot to say and to learn from scientific research for vision, in my view. Karthik, I would ask you a question, which is that I think of your work in terms of developing models, salient models that allow for depth or advancement of understanding with regard to human perception and then theories about perception. Can you see Escher prints as models with regard to the brain and mind?
Yeah, in the weeks leading up to this event, I've been thinking a lot about these Escher prints in relation to my work and my lab's work, and I've been thinking a lot in particular about what the fact that we can make sense of these images at all can reveal about the brain. So here I'm thinking in particular about Escher's images of impossible architecture. So for example, Belvedere. I think you showed a couple of these images in your slides. Actually, a funny story is that when the MIT Stratton Student Center was being built, students who were unhappy with the architectural decisions being made by the Institute pinned up a print of an Escher architectural impossible figure in order to make a statement about it. But I've been thinking a lot about the fact that when we look at those, our brains don't break, they don't explode. Going back to local patches, we can at least make sense of parts of it. So if I look at the top left corner, I can tell you, well, there's stairs here, and there's a person standing on those stairs. And in the bottom right corner, I can also say, well, there's stairs here, and there's other people on these stairs. I might not be able to relate these in 3D space, but I can at least make sense of patches. So what is it about the mind that allows us to do that? Why would evolution create a mind that is capable of doing that? Because the real world, of course, like definitionally, everything you would see is possible. So why is it even the case that we can make sense of the impossible? The infinite staircase, the one inspired by Roger Penrose's work, for example, like why doesn't that just cause our brains to explode? Why can we make partial sense of it? We can even isolate sometimes why there's something weird going on. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I think they're provocative and helpful in guiding vision science and ways of asking new questions about the visual system, and I think the mind more broadly. Yeah, I don't know, Colin, if you have more thoughts about this line or this thread.
So all that I can say is that our ability to discover whether or not a structure makes global sense, we have some of that ability, but we are not very good at it. In fact, if you look at in a slightly different context than the one that Escher works in, if you look at an old movie where the compositing artist has not done a very good job, so objects are lit from different directions, it doesn't really bother you very much. I mean, you can very easily let that scene be interpreted as a normal scene. So, just as you're saying, Karthik, we have privileged the analysis of local patches and not put very much machinery behind verifying that everything comes together. Because the real world is a benign world. The real world is not out to trick us by introducing all of these inconsistencies. So when we look at a painting like Belvedere, or I think it's Upside Down, or so all of these non-conforming staircases, we are happy to be able to make local sense. And it requires a kind of a cognitive puzzle-solving process to say, hey, there's something wrong there, but it's not perhaps an immediate perceptual process.
There's one more thing that I wanted to touch on, and then maybe we should go to audience questions. And that's related to actually the image that's behind us, and this idea of instability between what the figure is and what its background is. That's very, very salient in this image, where you can almost at will switch from the figure being the devils and the background or the ground being the angels, or the other way around, where the angels are the figures and the space around them is the devils. It's less salient, but still I think very, very important in puddle, which is the very first image we saw, where again the puddle, like, is that figure or is that ground? Is the ground figure or is the ground ground? I have a lot of questions about this. But the thing I want to touch on right now is what is going on in the brain, in the visual system, either in scientific terms or in experiential or phenomenological terms. What is going on when we make that switch from seeing figure and ground to ground and figure? One of my favorite books is by an MIT professor named George Steiny. It's called Shape. And in that book, he talks about how you can switch from seeing shapes as one thing to another, and that moment of switching, he calls that a saltation, like a kind of dance move, like imagine doing a cartwheel in your mind. And I'm wondering, all three of you really, from your different perspectives, what can you say about that? What is it about the mind that lets us see different things in the same thing, or can interpret different realities from the same perceptual input? How can we do that? How can we characterize the feeling of that? These are all questions I'm very interested in, all questions that Escher kind of brings to the front of my mind.
I'd like to comment on that. That's a great question, Karthik. Escher said, we adore chaos because we like to make order. So I think that elemental problem solving of sorting out all the input that we we get, and creating known images and patterns. It's a kind of magic that humans do. And to be self-conscious, which may be a uniquely human trait, is a rather peculiar thing, to see your place in all this stuff around us. It's a lot to take in, and how do we make sense of it?
Let me pick up on that. Some of you might already have seen this illusion. It's called the Dalmatian dog illusion. If you haven't, please do Google that phrase, Dalmatian dog illusion, and what you will see is a picture that seems like initially a meaningless collection of black blobs on a white background. So it's a purely black and white binary image. You stare at it, and initially it just seems like chaos, meaninglessness. But after a while, since the picture is called Dalmatian dog illusion, you have some clue about what the picture contains. And after maybe a few tens of seconds, it kind of snaps in, and you begin to see the dog in that picture. And once you see it, it becomes really clear exactly how the dog is standing, where his head is, and so on. That moment of discovery, where the world is kind of snapped into place, we would love to know what are the neural correlates of that happening. And in fact, even more interestingly, what are the precursors to that discovery happening, the eureka moment. And so far, we don't really have a clue as to what leads up to that magical moment.
I wonder if it depends on the number of times you have seen a Dalmatian. If you have never seen a Dalmatian, I wonder if those dots would form a creature as quickly. I think it's a kind of matching game our brain makes with things that we've seen and remembered, matching up with something unknown.
Almost certainly. So, in fact, staying on this picture, so once you have seen this, the Dalmatian dog emerge from this chaos, the second or third time or nth time that you see this picture, you cannot not see it. So that experience, having once had that experience, you are forever going to organize this perceptual input in that particular way. And similarly, to your point, having previously experienced Dalmatian dogs, I'm sure factors into your first-time interpretation of this picture.
At this point, I would like to introduce artistic abstraction. That is to say, it seems to me that we don't have to work with known images to have that moment of cohesion. We can have the moment of cohesion by marks on a canvas that don't add up to like an answer with regard to an object, but perhaps close, perhaps many possible objects, perhaps a kind of feeling state internal to the viewer. And so we can imagine artistic abstraction perhaps works with the visual mind in a way just short of clear images, but nonetheless is as powerful a stimulus as representation. So with that, if I may open it up to everyone to ask questions.
Hello, my name is Adrian. I'm a board member of the Netherlands America Foundation, so thank you very much for organizing this. I heard some Dutch behind me, so there's more Dutch people, so that's only good. So my question is for Mr. Price. Why is it that Escher, when he went to Italy, focused on the landscape instead of the architecture? Because it would make sense, right, to focus on architecture because it's so beautiful. So why did he focus on the landscape?
Goedenavond. It's a good question, and he did, in fact, focus on architecture. He made a total of 350 prints during his lifetime. But even the architecture has to do as much with light and shadow and shapes and textures as it has to do with the the buildings themselves. I think architecture necessarily involves a lot of shape making, but the landscapes, I think some of that comes from being in Holland, where you don't have the sort of distant views that you have in Italy, and he felt the richness of the visual experience in Italy was such a relief from the more conventional flat landscapes of Holland.
First of all, Mr. Price, that was a fabulous presentation.
I got a great audience, thank you.
I'd like to ask the professor and anyone else on the panel, is it because Escher's work primarily was in black and white? How does the brain process that as opposed to color?
That's such a wonderful question. And I find that especially appealing because we have a paper coming out in Science on exactly that. It's like this.
He's my husband.
So the question is a very interesting one. How is it that we are able to so seamlessly transfer our abilities or generalize from rich color to grayscale or even just purely black and white? And the question becomes especially puzzling when you look at the amount of neural resource the brain devotes to color processing. All across the visual pathway, you have neurons that are tuned to be sensitive to color. So the question is, what might be the root of this great generalizability we exhibit in being able to deal with color removed imagery? The answer that we are proposing in our work is that development may have part of the answer. So the argument goes as follows. When we start out our visual journeys, our cone system, the photoreceptors in the retina, they have two kinds of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Rods operate more in the low light and nighttime conditions. Cones operate during daytime conditions. And they also subserve color perception. The neonatal cones are very immature. So a newborn starts his or her journey of seeing with a very limited color palette. Over time, over say 4 to 6 months, the color system matures and the brain begins to receive good color information. Instead of thinking these initial months that have poor chromatic saturation, instead of thinking of them as limitations of biology, we can think of them as a feature nature has put into our learning process. So the brain is being forced to deal with poor color imagery in those initial few months, and the mechanisms that are being put in place are the ones that emphasize luminance over color. That initial experience perhaps helps us, even when we are more mature observers, to deal with the removal of color information. In fact, just a small note, and then I'll pause. The Prakash children who gain sight later in life, they start their visual journeys with mature retinas. So the very first introduction they have to seeing is with full color imagery. Instead of helping them, that immersion in color richness actually hurts their ability to deal with the removal of color. So we believe that nature has been really clever in terms of depriving us of color imagery at the outset of our visual
So
journeys.
when we look at an Escher, are we actually using that early
That's right.
understanding of what black and white is?
That's
Oh,
right.
absolutely.
That's right. That's right. That's our hypothesis. It may well be wrong, but that's
Oh,
the
wow.
position.
I've loved Escher since I got to college, and my roommate and I had the book. And we first were, of course, attracted to the geometrical trick ones, the falling water and stuff like that. But over time, then we found Mandelbrot and the fractals. And when I look at this image, and we argued about this at the time, that this is actually a fractal image because it's self-similar. In this one, there's at least 10 different layers. And it's very soothing because there's that self-similarity at all the different scales. And to us, it was always an amazing thing. And I knew nothing about who Escher really was, but especially hearing you talk today, to see that he arrived at this fractal image, which is a very mathematical construct from a graphic arts perspective. And you know, it's just, here he's doing this 20 years before Mandelbrot published the fractal work. And to see, is there some can't speak. Is this some sort of universal thing within us that this is so soothing and so comforting? Because I don't know why.
Well, Escher's